Perfect. I think we can start. Just a sec. Let me also just much better. Okay, so welcome everyone to now our 16th critical dialogue on reconciliation. This is the first one of this semester, which I think makes it especially special, but also makes me very nervous. So I'm gonna try to calm down as I introduce you all to this space. So my name is Lucia and I'm a member of Embrace Dialogue, or Rodemos el Diálogo. And today we're gonna think together about the role of identity in reconciliation by exploring the case of the FARC in Colombia. And we have someone really special with us who's gonna guide us slowly into the topic. First, I have to tell you that the event is part of a series of dialogues, so you can hopefully follow us and come to the rest of them and look also to the ones we already had online. They're organized by Winchester Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, Embrace Dialogue, and the Oxford Network for Peace Studies, which all together seek to start a multicultural, interdisciplinary, global dialogue about reconciliation. I'm trying to find more adjectives that I can join to this line of things, the line of ways of describing the dialogue that we're doing here. Also very, very important, no matter what your background, whether it's an academic, a practitioner, someone just passionate about dialogue or reconciliation, where you're from, we're always interested to hear your thoughts. So please do feel free to contribute and share your opinions and thoughts that will arise as we go through today's dialogue. So now almost 2 years ago, last year, we started our partnership with the University of Winchester and their Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, and also OxPeace. And we honestly couldn't be more proud and thankful for that connection. It's made us as a community much more interesting, and it's sort of brought together a lot of minds on reconciliation, peace building, and dialogue as well. If this is your first time and you've never been to one of these dialogues, very briefly about who we are as an organization. So Rodemos el Diálogo, or Embrace Dialogue, is a Colombian peace-building organization promoting the culture of dialogue, which Andre will soon explain a little bit more. In terms of the work we do, we are involved in different aspects of peace building. We do work in Colombia on the ground, mostly peace pedagogy and youth-led projects, but we also do global projects or events such as this dialogue today. And we always think about how we can take the learnings from our work in Colombia and apply them to other places around the world, but also how we can learn from people around the world and bring that knowledge and experience back to Colombia. In the chat box, just a little bit, I will post the links to where you can subscribe to our newsletter and also follow our work. And also another link where you will see the previous critical dialogues on our YouTube channel. I also will post a link to the Masters at Winchester University, which is a Masters in Peace Building and Reconciliation. And I can see today that there's a couple of students or former students from the Masters joining us today. So hi guys. And I will also post a link to the OxPeace webpage, so you can also explore their work and all the interesting things they do and add to this field. But I think now, on behalf of Embrace Dialogue, the Center for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, and the University of Winchester, and the Oxford Network for Peace Studies, welcome. I will hand over to Dr. Andre Gomez Suarez, the Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, and also the co-founder of Rodemos el Diálogo, who will convene the dialogue today, and also introduce today's special guest, the really, really wonderful Laura Costa Henken. Andre, please release me.
Thank you, Lucia, and thank you everyone who's joining. It's so good to see old faces and new faces, people who have joined in the past. As Lucia said, the idea of this space is to think together, and so that doesn't happen overnight. So it's really good to have people who have been coming to this series throughout the last few years. And for those of you who are new to this space, you're very, very welcome to join us in the future, and hopefully you can check some of the previous dialogues that we have done. At Winchester, we try to work with different students from across the world on theories of dynamics and reconciliation and the importance of dialogue. And dialogue is a fundamental part for these processes. And the reason why we believe deeply in this partnership, and we have called these spaces critical dialogues on reconciliation, is because Rodemos el Diálogo, or Embrace Dialogue, has developed 6 principles to try to nurture this dialogue space with you. And I would like to share those 6 principles with you so that we can all keep them in mind in order to be able to be in this hour and a half together and to make it a transformative space and a transformative moment. So the first principle for this space is generosity. So we invite you to be fully present in this space, to try to stop your multiple thinking processes that are happening about many other issues and try to nurture your full presence in this space to give the best of yourself. The second principle for a culture of dialogue is solidarity. So we invite you to try to listen deeply to different people's ideas, comments, and stories so that you can unleash your empathy and think about how to act in compassion when you are participating in our dialogue. The third principle is co-responsibility. So for this space to be a transformative space and for this dialogue to unfold, we need to feel that it's something that we hold together. So as Tai Nhat said, this is part of our interbeing, and we invite you to feel that you own this space. The fourth principle is honesty. We want to invite you in this space to speak from your experience, to be humble, and to recognize that probably you don't know everything, and to be genuine. The fifth principle is respect. We invite you to try to suspend judgment when you are listening to other people's opinions, ideas, and experiences, to try to, by suspending judgment, see your own reactions to what other people say, and then try to see where this takes you in probably unexpected places. And the final principle that we deeply believe in is self-criticism. So we invite you to acknowledge your own cognitive bias, to nurture your intellectual humility on these matters. And then if you leave this space feeling that you have somehow transformed a previous prejudice or an idea that you had, and we will feel that this has been a really important space for you all and for us too. These principles are important because we understand dialogue in a particular way. We are not here in a seminar. We are not here in a debate. We are here in a horizontal transformative process that gets closer to what the quantum physicist and dialogue theorist David Bohm would call a stream of meaning flowing among and through and between us. And so that's what we want to do here. So this space is going to be structured in basically 2 moments. One first moment where we are going to have a dialogue with Laura Hankin, who I'm going to introduce in a very short time, and a second moment where we would like to get your comments, your ideas, your thoughts, so that we can all think together. The first part is trying to create a common ground for all of us to be talking around a similar issue. We ask you, please do not drop any questions on the chat because we won't answer them. And what we would like to try to do is to try to keep following what the conversation is offering, to let your own thoughts flow with you. And once we start the second part of the dialogue, to start bringing those thoughts or those ideas without necessarily having to put them as forms of questions. In the second part, what we are going to do is we are going to first listen to many of you, seeing where this initial dialogue has taken you. And once you have put some ideas on the table, we will go back to Laura and we will see where your thoughts have taken her. And then we will go back to you. And then we will do the same for probably 2 or 3 rounds. And then at around 5:25 UK time, I will do a 5-minute, 3-minute wrapping up to try to see if I can offer some food for thought for future thinking. Let me then say that, as Lucia suggested, the idea is that please, when you are going to participate, as this is a dialogue, we would like to hear your questions. So it would be best if you have your camera on, if you put your hands up, and I will give you the chance to speak so that I can organize the different interventions when you are wanting to speak. This is live streamed, so you need to be aware of that. And I have to tell you that many of the students who I've been teaching this year at Winchester are telling me that it's becoming a very useful teaching tool, that people are going back to these dialogues and they are finding that it's not only about listening to experts talking about reconciliation, but seeing how people think together from different experiences. So you are contributing to our new teaching global techniques of trying to nurture reconciliation. So with this in mind, and without further ado, let me introduce Laura Hankey. I'm absolutely delighted to have Laura Hankey here. Laura is not only one of my closest friends, my closest colleagues in Rodemos el Diálogo, but she is a very bright PhD candidate who will be defending her PhD very, very soon at the University of Bristol. Laura has had an incredible career. You wouldn't believe she's gone all the way from teaching maths in the UK and in England and in Colombia. But from there, she has always been thinking about how transformations, change happen in people's lives. And probably that's being connected to her own British Colombian roots, because she is half British, half Colombian. After being a teacher for many years in schools, she decided to study a master's, two masters, to understand processes of terrorism, impact of conflict and violence on different populations. She did a master's in education, in politics and international development, and a research in security, conflict, and justice at the University of Bristol. And from there, Laura started a PhD that is funded by the ESRC, and she has been focusing on the case of Colombia, and in particular, the construction of identities in the process of reincorporation of former FARC combatants following the signing of the 2016 peace agreement. Her research interests extend all the way from transitional justice to peace building. She has worked for the Colombian Truth Commission, as well on a project exploring international projects exploring the role of education in transitional justice. She worked for the MEMPAS project of the University of Bristol, trying to understand the work of grassroots communities in memory building work and reconciliation. But she has also been linking this research on education and transitional justice with a project called EdJam, that is a collaborative international network developing creative ways to teach and learn about violence and injustice. Finally, now she, as member of Rodemos el Diálogo, she joined almost 5 years ago. She has moved through very different roles. She has been in our academic teams, in our thematic teams, and our strategic work. Currently, she is the transnational coordinator of Rodemos el Diálogo, meaning my boss, and the leading peace building efforts of the organization in Antioquia, Colombia. So as you can see, we have a great person in front of us. Let's see how we can work with these hierarchies imposed on me. And I hope that we manage to create this hierarchical space, starting with our guest speaker here. So, Lau, shall we start? The topic of this dialogue is, I would say, seems quite simple, but in my view, is humongous. 2 words where I see very, very little agreement on: identity and reconciliation. So to try to unpack this, why don't we start with identity? What do you mean or when you think about identity, what is identity? Are we talking about individual identity, collective identity? How can we start grasping this idea of identity before we jump into the other topics?
Thank you, Andre. And it's a pleasure to be here. It's funny that everything that you've just said in terms of a bio is a form of identity, right? A form of presenting myself. And even before we started, I'd mentioned about how we show ourselves on the camera is a way of how we're trying to sort of present our identities to other people. And you're right, there is no single answer. Every single one of you right now, I'm sure, has a slightly different idea in your head of what identity means to you or how you think around it. I will also start by saying I am by no means an expert on everything. This is my stance on how I see identity and how I've used it in my research and how I think about it, but it's an ever evolving idea as well, and it's full of contradictions. And that's the other thing that I think is important to say here. It is also an absolutely mammoth task. So this is just some starting points to hopefully get the dialogue going between us all. One quote that I like, I'm a good one. I do like quotes. Not everyone likes them, but I do. Is from the novelist Chimamanda Adichie. He says, "Identity is about all of us. It shapes the way we deal with the world and the way the world deals with us." And I think it's a really nice starting point because it represents the idea that identity is also not just about us and the individual and the self, but something social as well. It's about how we interact with other people. And that way, I guess, let me set out the idea of identity from 3 different points. One is exactly that, this idea of the internal and the external, the individual and the social. Many of the initial romantic ideas that there are around identity tend to be about this idea of some inner true nature to us, some inner conviction. It's where the ideas of the self, the ego, all come out, and then you start getting into Freud and other ideas. But it's this idea that there's something innate in us that's a starting point. And actually, we can see that reflected in how Western societies in general have developed. I don't know if you've come across the ideas, any of you have come across the ideas of Joseph Heinrich, for example, and weird societies, Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic societies. And it's funny how there's a lot that's in there, by the way, in his work. But one idea that I think is really interesting is if you ask someone who they are, in these weird societies, they tend to come out with personal attributes to define themselves. So that they're curious or that they're kind or that they're a journalist or something else. There's it's very personal attributes that come up. Whereas if you go to sort of non-weird societies, it tends to be more relationship based. So it might be that you're someone's father or your sister, or it's some connection that you have with other people. And it's a wonderful way, I think, of showing that there are different ways of looking around identity and that it is not just one or the other. It's not just about how we relate to other people. It's not just how we see ourselves inside or what comes from that, but it's this tension that comes up between. And that's something that's evolved when you look at identity research and identity sort of thinking. We've moved away from a lot of those essentialist ways of looking at identity and moved into this idea that it's something more constructed, something socially constructed, something that's in relation to other people. And again, another quote from Hannah Arendt, "No human life, not even the life of a hermit in nature's wilderness, is possible without a world which directly or indirectly testifies to the presence of other human beings." And it's true. We are social beings by nature, so it seems strange to me to think of identity as anything other than social. In that case, then, it's also worth thinking about identity in terms of how we define it. How do we set up an identity? And if we go back to its Latin roots, it's an idea of sameness. Idem is the root from where it comes from. And that in itself tends to then create boundaries. So we tend to have then this in-group and out-group. Those are the same as us and those that are different from us in that particular aspect. And it's fair to say that to define anything, we have to think of what it is in relation to what it's not, right? So if I want to define this bottle, I need to know that it's not a glass or a jar or something else, right? And then if we're going into something concept more abstract, to understand light, we need to know dark, or there's a lot of the other things that come up. To know that we're happy at times, we need to know what sadness is, etc. So we tend to have these boundaries, and we tend to actually end up almost with binaries sometimes as well that can come out with identities. And in conflict, if I'm starting to try and link it a little bit more to reconciliation of the things that we're coming on to, in conflict, we tend to find that those boundaries become hardened. Why? Because it's a survival and safety issue, really. So what you're trying to do is tighten and harden around this idea of who we are and who I'm safe with, who's the same as me and who's in my group and who's not in my group. And so it's a lot safer to pull in and a lot clearer to be able to say, you're the dangerous other that I don't want to be associated with. That is to be said, that doesn't always have to turn into the other, but it's definitely this case of two groups that can be there. And we tend to find that following on actually through into peace building and transitional justice issues, where particularly when you look at human rights frameworks and the legal side of things, you again tend to have the boundaries. You're a victim or you're a perpetrator, for example. So this again can play into issues when you're looking at how to reconcile and overcome those boundaries and borders that are there around identities. But I guess my final point that I wanted to say around identity is more around its nature, which is that it's multiple. We're not one thing. We all know that we have different identities. I mean, Andre, when he introduced me, put a whole load of different identities on the table and missed out a whole load of other identities that I would relate to myself, right? And that other people have also validated. It's also something that's fluid and changing. And I think that's important to bring in. So Jenkins talks about two types of identity: nominal identity, which is something that's assigned to us, like a name that's assigned to us, a category. And then that's not completely the same as what it is to live that identity. It's a virtual identity. And I think that's important as well. It's these things that it's not a fixed being. So we can say that, we can say that someone's an academic. This is quite an academic space. We can say that someone's an academic and that's an identity. But actually what it means to be an academic and live that identity will be slightly different for each person and will continue to change and evolve as well, right? Even though there's some sense of stability maybe in what it is to an extent, we all have a kind of rough idea, but it's still a little bit fuzzy around the borders. And I think that's important, like this idea of that there's an evolving side of it. And that names change with time, the meanings that are ascribed to those names change with time. And in the case of conflict and peace, that's even more important because we need these ideas of re-identification, re-understanding what the other is. And we've seen these things come up through time, you know, identities that previously maybe have been negative, maybe that somehow we turn into something positive. But I'll leave it there because I know that Andre is going to say that we should keep the dialogue flowing into other ideas. So there's my starting point for you, Andre. Where do you want to take it?
Yeah, that's great, Laura. I mean, you already took me to I don't know, probably Marcel Proust is the first name that comes to my mind, because with the last few things that you were mentioning, in particular, this idea of how identity is fluid. You said it's multiple, it's fluid. And before that, you mentioned this important element of the in-group and the out-group. The idea of how much we need the other to, in a way, define ourselves. So that made me think of Marcel Proust. And I thought if I could change the title of his famous book, you know, In Search of Time Lost, you know, and I changed it, I put it In Search of Identity, you know, how much of that search that is sometimes is a transcendental journey, is a painful one throughout our life, the search for identity. To what extent do we find like some appeasement or some of the answers that we're looking for in the other? How can we use the other as part of our journey in that search for identity? That's like the sort of question that started to come into my mind. And I think that might end up bringing us then into very specific others.
Okay, it's a very deep, meaningful question. Although, as you well know, I mean, why am I looking at identity in my PhD? Because it's an ever personal search for my own identity and to reconcile the different identities within myself, particularly around how Colombia fits in and my Colombian roots. But I think I hadn't really talked around how identity is constructed. I mentioned that it's socially constructed, but I hadn't actually talked about that at all. I think there are different ideas that come up with that. But most of those ideas tend to involve others. They don't tend to come from oneself only. So if you're looking at Foucault and the idea that it's discursive and it's through things that are being talked about and said and brought out in different power relations and so on, then there's one way that you can kind of look at it in a very abstract way a bit more. There are others then who look at it more, so Goffman or Butler or others that look at it more in terms of repetitive acts. So it's things that you're doing in relation, your interactions with other people that help to reinforce different identities. You've also got Hackey, who talks about this looping effect. So you adapt or make choices in how you interact with other people to sort of distinguish yourself maybe from how they've labeled you. So it's another way of kind of shifting or making sense of your identity. But if I go away a little bit from my research and even what I've sort of discovered maybe more in life and through other experiences in peace building, is it's also a case of learning from others. Often the things that you see in others are things that are to do with yourself. So we often find also when we criticize others, it tends to be because it's something that we do ourselves that annoys us, and we kind of then see it in others, right? That's what we pick up. So I think the other is fundamental to our own identities, both in constructing it and in helping us understand better who we are, whether it's who we are in terms of the same as other people or who we are in terms of differences that we have. But we need another reference point. We have to have the other there somewhere. We have to have an other there somewhere.
That's brilliant, because, okay, that sounds beautiful at the interpersonal level, but I wanna, let's now extrapolate this, because why don't you tell us, I mean, let's look at this now at the national level, you know, I mean, the perfect other, I would say, and many people might disagree with me, the perfect other to shape the national identity of Colombia between 1964 and 2016, to say the least, was the FARC. That was the other. So that probably tells us more about Colombia than about the FARC. But let's don't even get into that. I mean, what would it tell us? I mean, that the other was the FARC. What does it tell us about the national identity of Colombians? Quite something, isn't it? But let's probably leave that and see if some people want to come back to that in the open dialogue, and if you also want to touch upon this. But I would be more interested in trying to see the identity of the FARC in a way. If you could, because you've been doing this research, so what are the changes that you think or that you can tell us that you have seen in the way how the FARC see themselves, or the people you have researched who are part of the FARC? How have this identity of the FARC changed over the years?
I'm going to bring the two bits together a little bit, though, because I think, again, having just said that it's not just about oneself or internal, I think it's important to see how others have seen them and how that's changed as well. So as a starting point, you are absolutely right, Andre, that this inner enemy has been what was being constructed up to there. And the FARC in particular represented the other. So when people thought about conflict and violence in Colombia, it was the FARC. So the idea of a peace agreement with the FARC in 2016, the FARC being the largest guerrilla group at the time, the absolute focus of it was this will end the conflict. Obviously, we found that there's a whole load of other armed groups that have been operating and not found that. We've known that for many years. But I mean, it's funny how the FARC literally became synonymous with everything to do with the conflict up to that point. So how has that changed? I think a key relationship to look at first of all is with the state. So with the Colombian state having initially set them up as terrorists or narco-terrorists, guerrillas, insurgents, illegal. They were an illegal armed group for that matter, combatants fighting against the state. The other, all of this fed in, by the way, to the war on terror. If we're linking into other contexts, the war on terror more generally in the world also fed into them being this idea of terrorists as well. It was a wonderful merging that happened at the start of the 2000s. What did they become subsequently? Ex-combatants, so still linked to this idea of conflict before, non-identities that have been coming up. Persons in reincorporation, so persons in the process of reincorporation, That's another identity that's linked to them, because reincorporation is the specific form of reintegration that they're following, having handed over their weapons to the UN actually rather than the Colombian state, and then followed through kind of on some path towards peace and a legal civilian life. But actually, it's important to add in there that in some cases as well, they are colleagues. They're in Congress, they're in the Senate, and so on. So for some, it's sort of colleagues and others that are there in the same spaces. So there are some other ones that are there, but I'd say it's a very interesting shift in identity that's happened that hasn't necessarily taken them fully away from their conflict identities yet. It sort of set them up as, as sort of non-identities at the moment that are still problematic to an extent, but the state still needs to look after them because there's a lot of security issues that are going on, and it's sort of almost become like a father-child role again as they're trying to bring them back into the fold. That's the way the state sees it. With the FARC themselves, I think it's a really interesting shift that's happened, and in some cases not a shift at all. And I think it's also the set of identities that has been least considered by them and least considered by others. I think it's that in general, everything around the FARC internally hasn't really been brought out, certainly within the reincorporation process, too much. They came from very ideological origins. I wouldn't say that every single person in the FARC followed that when they were fighting, but fighting in the armed group. But it's certainly true that they have, they draw on ideas of Marx and Leninism and moved through socialism, and it's shifted, but there's definitely kind of a set ideology that they were following through. And they were a people's army. They transformed into a people's army in the 80s. So it was this idea of fighting for the people and fighting for their rights and fighting for change in Colombia so that it's fairer for everyone. And they also held on to a very strong belief of being of having a gender equality. And that's a very interesting shift that's come afterwards, where we know that gender equality was maybe parity in roles, so everyone did the same roles, but actually what it meant to be a woman in the FARC previously and what it means to be a woman now, having been in that group, you start to see there's a little bit of a myth maybe around how they perceive themselves that hasn't necessarily been validated subsequently. What do I mean by that? Women now obviously do want to take on motherhood. They do want to look after their house to an extent. They do carry. There's a lot of the traditional roles in Colombian society that they're taking on, but there's still also this idea that they want to be able to do the same things as men as well. There's sort of interesting tensions that are playing out there. And how do they see themselves generally, sort of separate from gender? Peace signatories, people in the reincorporation process as well. That's fair. It's a neutral statement, I think, for them, a neutral identity. They reject the idea of ex-combatants. They reject the idea of that, particularly because they're still fighting. They themselves are still fighting, just now without weapons. And they reject other terms like demobilized and reinserted that come from previous reintegration processes because they see their process as very different. The key difference that I haven't come onto there is that it's collective. And here again, we start to see individual and collective identities becoming important. For them, the collective identity that they were following onto was the party. So they thought they'd take the FARC armed group and they turn it into the FARC political party. And that would be a collective identity that could continue, and they could keep their ideology and they keep all the other things happening and still go for change, but now via political means. And actually, we've seen that party hasn't been as cohesive as they thought. There's been divisions, not everyone feels represented. And basically that these transitions of identities from a conflict perspective where you have hierarchies and orders and it's sort of a military side to something that's a bit freer in peacetime, and people can have their own initiative and as individuals start to have more of a voice and agency doesn't sort of follow through as easily as they thought. And I guess the last little final point around the community I was just going to say was, in terms of their relationship with the community, there you have even more tensions that come up. Because in conflict, people, so they were armed and they were murderers and they did horrible things, but they also helped in many ways. Sometimes they helped with other armed groups that were operating. You'll see sort of mixed feelings around what's happened. And subsequently in peacetime, again, you have slightly different perspectives that are coming out. So there's still perpetrators in many things and people don't always trust. Trust is a key issue in all of this, by the way. But they're also neighbours and colleagues in other sort of contexts. So there's a lot of tensions that are coming up. And again, this is where I'm trying to say that there are a lot of contradictions that tend to come up within identities and how we start to relate to the other. Go ahead, Andrew.
Listening to you, I mean, and thank you, because it's a very rich way of helping us in two particular dimensions that you have done fantastically. You know, one in the relationship with the state and how the state is seeing them. I think you made it very clear how they continue to be labeled in a particular way that they actually do not agree with necessarily. You know, you made it very clear. And then their own conception of themselves, how there are tensions there, but how, you know, things in the past and now some of them reverberate. But what I couldn't stop thinking, and I wonder if you can, if you have found something in your research and you can share some thoughts on this, is how their idea of the other has changed. So they had a very clear other, didn't they? I mean, they were fighting the bourgeoisie. I don't know, they were fighting imperialism. The other was the enemy that pushed them to take up arms, to fight for peace and justice. And suddenly, there you have Timoshenko shaking hands with Santos. There you have, you know, like Congress members of the FARC in Congress shaking hands with Uribe, trying to say, President Uribe, please come on, you know, be more constructive. So and I think this is gonna start to take us into reconciliation somehow. I mean, I think we're starting to get to there. So any thoughts of how this change of the idea of the other is paving the way for us to start thinking about the relationship between identity and reconciliation in the case of the FARC?
Yeah, and I think it's important not only to think about the other for the FARC, but the other for the state, because the state obviously now doesn't have the other as the FARC. The other is now multiple other groups. It's far more diffuse. It's now not as simple for the state as to who they're fighting directly. Although there's still an element, yeah, there's still sort of other bits that are coming on there. But for the FARC, you're right. The other, there's still the same fight in many ways. If you look at what they're doing in the political party, there's still an element. But the problem is, it's not the other in terms of I'm fighting you and I'm against everything. It's now I have to work with the other as well to try and make some of these changes happening as an element of working within, because when they're in Congress, they can't just, you know, go off on their own side. Now there's pacts and coalitions that are coming in that they're having to make. In fact, the poor success of the FARC party on its own, which has now become Comunes. I should stop talking about it as the FARC party because they changed their name a little while ago. That has led to the need for coalition, and they've had a lot of joining up with others. Fair enough, it's still against the traditional parties, and you can still speak to the others and say traditional parties, and they still want change and they still want other things. But I think it's far more toned down. It's not as simple as us against them. You've got a lot of the fuzziness of boundaries that are coming back in again. You can't say there's a clear the other. It's now just there are others that they're going against. And as I say, I think even the ideology has become more diffuse as well. So there are certain people still that are very much for that and still want certain change, but there are others that are maybe slightly more relaxed around it now and are just trying to find a different way through in peacetime. So I think even when you think about the FARC as an identity previously in conflict, we have to remember that it wasn't coherent and it wasn't just a single group that was absolutely the same through and through. There was a whole meld of different identities, and within that, therefore, there was a whole host of different motivations for people that were fighting in the group at the time. Different reasons why they joined, different reasons why they stayed, and then different reasons of what they're looking for now in peacetime, which all feeds into their identities as well.
So if I'm listening correctly to you, and you really make me think of, you know, perhaps one of the most important psychologists working on identity and reconciliation, Kelman, because Herbert Kelman has this very interesting idea that he says that the primary change that happens in a party's identity that is involved in a reconciliation process is the removal of the negation of the other as a central component of their own identity. And what he says is that this negation of the other is an important part of their identity in intractable conflicts, but is not part of the core identity of the party. So the important thing is that throughout creating the right conditions, he says, throughout creating the right conditions, you can help the parties that were involved in the destruction of each other. You can involve them in a process to try to realize that they can stop the negation of the other, the negation of the existence of the other as an essential part of their identity, and focus on their core identity that doesn't need that in order to feel that that core identity is not threatened. So this is interesting because in a way what you are saying is the FARC feel that they fight for social justice is not threatened anymore. That is their core identity, was we fight for social justice. With arms or without arms, that's whatever. So if the state is able to recognize that we still fight for social justice, is that the state is accommodating that other and says, fine, you're acknowledging you are not a threat for me, I'm able to work with you and to reconcile instead of having to destroy you. So in a way, this whole idea of, you know, and this whole idea of how do we create the conditions to stop the negation of the other is absolutely important. And Kelman says that what, you know, that you could use, like, create 5 conditions or so. But the things that I think will help me ask you then the next question to start wrapping up this part of our dialogue and start asking people to come and ask questions and make comments has to do with 2 in particular. Because one of that, he says, is you need to create a process of mutual acknowledgement of each other's humanity. So when the state used to talk about the other as terrorist, it was dehumanizing the other. But now the possibility of, you know, you are not terrorist, you are, whether it's ambiguous still or not, and also the FARC, I guess my question there would be the FARC acknowledging the rule of law, the FARC acknowledging the state, before somehow it's like we are willing to agree that we live under the rule of law that has a state with a particular structure, and we're not going to try to destroy it. So there is a mutual acknowledgement there that allows the reinvention, the creation of new relationships in a way. And then the second one is the establishing of patterns of interaction and mechanisms for cooperation, which are based on creating people-to-people activities. And that's what I wanted to ask you, because to talk about this in the abstract terms, you know, like the Colombian state acknowledging the FARC is one thing, but another thing is the local mayor of a town engaging with the foot soldier of the FARC that in the past probably put a bomb and blew a police station or something like that. And now they are needing to come to. So what are the sort of journeys or things that you've seen in this journey towards reconciliation? What are the steps forward and the steps and the challenges that you've seen in the region that you're researching in terms of the interaction with the members of the FARC, or former ex-combatants of the FARC, peace signatories, however they want to call themselves, and the politicians and the communities, and the way how they have accommodated themselves to create a common future together, or even a common present?
Okay, to begin with, I'm going to say we have to recognize Colombian society is full of contradictions. And one of them will also be, for example, different viewpoints. So you were talking before about social justice, and now the state saying, okay, we recognize your fight for social justice and we'll accommodate it. You have to recognize in Colombia, there's still quite low levels of tolerance for having different perspectives and different viewpoints. And we know that at different levels, whether it's on a local level, whether it's a national level, there's still challenges around having different viewpoints to maybe the mainstream. Around your ideas for, or not your ideas, Kelman's ideas around negating the other and also local level reconciliation. The idea of humanizing the other is critical. And I think that's far easier at a local level than it is at a national level or any other level. Why? Because you're literally now talking about one person relating to another person. And that's the easiest way to start to find the humanity in the other. It's the same as when we try and do dialogues. And the idea is that they're small spaces whereby everyone knows who everyone else is in the room. You can have a personal conversation with them up to the point that you want, obviously, there's nothing forced, but it's a lot easier to build that kind of relationship, of which trust is fundamental. And I think within that, that's the other contradiction that comes in, or one of the biggest challenges in all of this, is around overcoming the huge distrust that exists within Colombian society, and that exists again on all levels. What have I seen here at a local level? In Dabeiba and Llano Grande, it's a great example of reconciliation. It's held up as one of the examples of reconciliation. It's one of the areas where there's been a zone or a transition zone for those, for some members of the FARC who've been going through the reincorporation process to be. So that's where they handed over weapons, it's where they've been living, and where they've been going through that process. Each of those areas has always had the armed forces there and police and other institutions and so on. And this is where you've seen some of that local reconciliation happening. Why? They can all go and play football together, and it's not a problem. People are walking around and talking to each other and working together and doing things. There are community projects. I think the idea of having a common purpose is a good way of starting to, one, rebuild trust, but also find ways of reconciling. But I think the problem of reconciliation is something that I think you and I have talked about before, Andre, about the different levels of it. You know, reconciliation can mean just the fact that you can be in the same space and coexist, not hate the other, even if they've done something terrible. Because actually, you have to remember in Dabeiba as well, it's one of the most conflict affected areas. It's not always been the one that's been most talked about. More recently, it's come up because of the false positives cases, which has actually been the state as the perpetrator as such, rather than the FARC, of taking civilians and dressing them up as combatants and representing them as deaths in combat. But Dabeiba has a huge number of victims, and a lot of those have been at the hands of the FARC. So you're absolutely right. This could have been a really, really, really difficult moment, and something that didn't work at all. I think there has been a lot of willingness to be open and try from the part of the community from the very start. They accepted having the zone, the area here of the FARC to receive them. And there's been work that's been ongoing to sort of, keep that going and to work together and to have, as I say, community projects to help improve the lives of everyone here. So whether it's rebuilding houses or helping or fix the road in places, or, as I say, football games that they've had together and tournaments and other things. There's been lots of different ways to make it happen. But I think it's still more superficial than you think. I mean, it's there and there's coexistence, but there's still elements of distrust. There's still certain elements of separation. There's still, it depends how we want to define reconciliation. And there I'm going to say I'm not an expert. So I leave that. I'd love to hear more from other people as well on how they see that side of things.
Brilliant, Laura. Thank you so much for that. So I think we have lots of food for thought on the table. I think, we've been here for about 35 minutes, exchanging ideas, opinions with Laura. I think this is the moment where it would be really important to start getting your own thoughts on this. So you are very welcome to start your putting hands up now, so that I can give you the chance to speak in the order that you feel like. And also, if you don't have questions or comments so far, we could start also putting a question for all of us, if that could also be a trigger. And do you have, I see many faces here of people who know the case of Colombia, and people who know other cases. Do you want to bring another experience of something that you've seen in the process of reconciliation, changing identities in the case of the FARC in Colombia, that might help us continue thinking about this and exploring other avenues that we haven't touched so far? So that's, you're very welcome to reflect on that, or you're also very welcome to ask a question or to make another general comment of what this dialogue so far has offered you to think about these issues. Crystal, please.
Hello, everyone. I have to leave shortly, so I'm just going to jump a little bit ahead. I'm very interested in what you had to say, and I keep thinking about the youth, the identity of the youth, because I just got back from Bosnia with my husband, talking about, exposing students about, the 30-year conflict. And, I met many, many youth that said, you know what, this is not our conflict anymore. We weren't there, we're not responsible, we have other things that we need and we want. So I'm really interested in, how can we look at identity to where it gets to a healthier sense for the individual, but also the collective as to the youth and, going forward, because, in the experiences I had is they actually got a lot of pushback from the adults, from the elderly. So they were almost seen a little bit like traitors.
Great. That's a really fantastic new idea on the table that I'm sure is gonna unleash into lots of thinking for many of us here. Frances.
I was wondering maybe what the role of trauma identity is as well. So maybe if with past experiences of trauma, there are aspects that a person can't accept of themselves, then that's harder to trust others. And I don't know, I'm just as a kind of, if that kind of feeds into it, I'd love to hear your thoughts around that, sort of that aspect.
Trauma in particular, you said, huh? Brilliant. Okay, Alejandro.
Hi, Andre, and thank you, Laura. This is so extremely, extremely interesting, and it's a great way to complement the visit I gave you recently to La Beiba, and to understand this element of your research that I think we didn't delve into too much when trying to analyze and understand the opportunities and the challenges as well in at the ground level. And I think that's where I wanted to perhaps comment on, and it's that tension that exists between the official, the higher level, which you very, very eloquently addressed. And I also want to point, just to add to that, what you said, the importance of the stories that are told about the conflict. You mentioned it, who's a victim, who's a perpetrator, and what is done about those identities and at what level. Because yes, the grassroots and the official exist at very, very different planes, and they interact and they dynamize in extremely, extremely different ways. But what happens up top really does impact what happens at the grassroots. And for instance, I was thinking about, well, the stories that are told by the Colombian Truth Commission, which I think many people criticize it, but I do personally think it's a very complex narrative of the conflict that is promoted, a very plural, with lots of different forms of suffering, and trying to be as less hierarchical as it can possibly be. And that also makes me think about the Sri Lankan case, where, for instance, you have a very straightforward binary between terrorists and well, goodies and baddies, essentially, and the narratives that are told about that, and how essentially and eventually we might be seeing the resurgence of conflict due to very deep grievances, because what is being done about these identities of victims and perpetrators. And again, that just goes back to the stories that are told about conflict and the different ways we can see them taking place. And again, Colombia, in my view, in the stories that are told about the conflict, is a very good case, and it is an example to the world. Perhaps we haven't seen the progress that many people would have expected, especially from the legal elements of the transitional justice mechanism, like the HEP, which does erode the confidence of the public in these mechanisms. But even when we've got such a good and complex narrative that is promoted about these identities, it's still extremely challenging. And I think it makes me feel, a bit scared about the future of this and other processes, when it's such a big example and a good example, we still see identities being hardened around precisely sectarian politics, usually.
That's great, Alejandro, and that makes me think of if I'm correct, your participation in a TV program in Colombia, precisely talking about the position that different actors take in Colombia in identity terms when we are thinking about the rulings of the JEP. So the rulings of the JEP, that we see them as helping apparently in the way to deal with the wrongdoings of the past to move in the road to reconciliation, is hardening very particular identities that fight against those same rulings. I can see 3 more hands up, but I think it would be a good idea to see also where Laura's thoughts are so far, and then we will go back and listen to other people's ideas and comments. So I think let's go, Laura, and see where you've been taken so far.
I'm loving this, by the way. I think this is a wonderful flow of thought that's happening, and I'm loving the fact that other cases are coming in. So we're not just talking about Colombia, but we're bringing in Bosnia and Sri Lanka and lots of other cases. It's really interesting, actually, what you were talking about, Crystal, with Bosnia, because it reminds me as well a little bit of what I heard in one of the EDGAM projects, actually, in one of the conferences, talking about a Palestine case, and I saw very similar things happening. There's pushback with adults around, you have to see them as the other, and you have to see them as the enemy, and you have to hold on to all of those conflict ideas. You can't have a different idea as youth. And that rejection, I think, is actually quite damaging as well when you're looking at the new identity or the identities that those youth want to take on, which doesn't have to be the same. And I think also, if you look at the UK context or Europe, etc., you start to see how's the First and Second World War, for example, now being carried out, now that a lot of those that were fighting in it are no longer around. How is that being repositioned and re-identified now with those that are now hearing about it in history books or from what they're being told, rather than having any direct experience? And I also think it's important to look at the case of children and youth anyway, because in peace processes, they can often be forgotten, whilst also having all of the pressure of peace building and creating a new future on their shoulders. So I think they're a pivotal group to be looking at always when you're looking at these kinds of groups. But it kind of took me more along the ways as well of thinking of, one, Colombia is a different example because it's ongoing conflict. So I think it's difficult for young people to completely escape the idea of violence and conflict and things that are going on, because they're actually often still experiencing it or hearing about it or seeing it, which links in a little bit with the trauma question that was coming up, or thoughts that were coming up, because I think one thing that has happened in Colombia is a considerable normalization of violence. And I say that even if it's not to do with the armed conflict. I mean, the fact that videos and things that happened of accidents or other things are freely shared, and everyone wants to look at them and everyone wants to see the violence and horrible things that are going on, whatever age you are, I should add. This isn't just adults, this is children that are looking at it as well and are being shown it. It's fascinating the level at which violence has been normalized here. And also, therefore, that links in with acceptance of justice to those things, So, oh, this person was killed, but, well, it's because we know that they robbed this shop, a few days ago, so that's fine. There's elements of that are coming in with identity that I think also is linking in with the idea of trust that was coming up. And it's a sense still of not being able to overcome the distrust of the other. Your starting point is to distrust rather than in other societies where you think trust. But I have to say it's an evolving thought for me as to what that looks like and how it happens. I think it's really interesting to start to engage it here as well, as I try to link up my experiences in spending a lot of time in the UK and now sort of living very much in the midst of it in Colombia. It sort of becomes a different thing. And I also think the idea of having a healthier identity for the nation is important. I think something that came out of a workshop I did with FARC members in the reincorporation process a couple of weeks ago was this idea of, we see ourselves in Colombia as violent, as brutos, as, that's very much fed in with the national identity. I don't know how much, again, in cities, I think it seems slightly differently, but I think those there's still this sense that violence is an integral part of the national identity. And I think it's important to try and take that out. And I think it's also because it's very easy to focus on the negative and focus on the conflict and focus on the violence and focus on that side within identity, forgetting all of the wonderful things that also come into the country. The fact that it's a backpacker's choice in Latin America. People go, why? Because of the warmth of the people and the beautiful countryside and everything else that goes on. So I think it's very easy to see the negative. And I think part of that journey to a healthier identity is starting to recognize that side, as well as obviously tackling all of the issues that are there. And I think in terms of Alejo's points. Oh, there's loads there. It reminds me again of something else with Uganda around the idea of re-identifying. I always hold on to this in the museum, the traveling museum that they had, where they had conflict objects that were being re-identified with a new purpose, which to me was a really powerful symbol. And I think it's the same whether we're talking about objects or we're talking about groups or people. I think this idea of re-identification is critical. And actually it speaks to Crystal's point as well around youth and new identities, right? We need to start putting new meanings and new ways of seeing things that maybe previously were held as conflict. But I think it's also important, and I go back to Butler's ideas around identity really, that it's not quick changes. Butler looks at identity as something that's constructed through repetitive acts and it's over time, and it's you can shift and change them, but we're not talking about radical changes overnight. And I think it's the same thing with, you know, if you're looking at peace building, you're looking at a lot of these are long-term processes that need validating. They need validating by all, but they're just slow. Yeah, I'd say more, but I'd rather let the thoughts keep flowing.
I mean, we have 4 hands up, and I think you are giving more food for thought. And I think this stream of meaning is like Bomb would be just so impressed by us. Thank you guys for creating this Magdalena River of meaning in this space. So, so lovely to see Marika here. So, Marika, over to you.
Hey, nice to see you again, Andre. Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. I think one thing that struck me, and I think the ear I was listening with, so I just spent the last 7 months in Syria, where there's still an active conflict, and kind of hearing, and I was asked in an interview, actually, in a job interview recently, like, do you see any openings for peace building in Syria? And my answer was a flat out no, I can't see it, because there is no trust and there is no justice and accountability. And I think I found it quite interesting what you were saying, and kept coming back to about the level of trust and distrust in the society, in the mechanisms that are there. And yeah, I just kept building on that of like, how important is it? Because I think I remember answering that question so immediately that I don't think in an active conflict, when there is not possible that other narratives are pursued, because you end up in prison immediately. You cannot change your identity posts. You cannot move from the truth that is kind of given to you. Then there isn't really a way to move towards reconciliation with those parts of society that are not possible. But yeah, I was wondering if that has also been an experience in Colombia, where I know it's completely different context. But at the same time, I think seeing a society moving towards trust and towards reconciliation, and seeing also the impact of like, how much do they trust the mechanisms that have been put in place to see justice and also accountability for actions happening, and how much that had an impact on reconciliation really happening.
Thank you. That's there you go. That's amazing. Thanks so much, because I think we're going to continue flowing in a very particular direction. Let me go back now to Rahu. Rahu, over to you.
Thank you so much, Andre. I have really enjoying this conversation so much. I think that the issues that we're addressing are really issues worldwide around identity. And I do think, I'm glad you guys brought in Bosnia and Sri Lanka and Syria. And now I want to bring in Kashmir, because I've been working in Kashmir. And there's this very, you know, I'm Indian, I was brought up in the West, but I always felt Indian in my heart. So that identity of feeling Indian in my heart, but yet living in the West, and how can I make a contribution to that region? Because the region is confused because of identity. When the British came, they created a lot of false identity, false separations, like pitting brother against brother. And really, they were really brothers at one time. I mean, the identity of India as a South Asian country of Sri Lankans, Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Nepalese, Bhutanese, they're all one from one identity. But how that identity got used against them and then manipulated. So what you were talking about, Andre, from going from the core, as Kelvin says, from core identity to the non-core identities, that movement is artificial. I have a core identity, but I've created all these non-core identities that were created artificially in order for certain gains and certain positions. So my interest is very deeply is how to go back to the core identity. And I'm working on that in India, because if we can go back to our core identity, then we really realize that Muslims love Hindus, and Hindus love Christians, and Christians love Muslims. They all love to be in each other's ceremony and traditions. And it's like, wow, we're rich to have so much, That core identity was fractured away. So I'm very curious to hear what you have to say and what the conversation goes on. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. I guess, again, this is connected, and I wonder what Laura is thinking, when she was mentioning this idea of multiple identity, flexible, fluid. Is there a possibility to go to a core identity or not? Is that movement that Kelvin mentioned something that we would agree with him or not? But anyway, before going back to Laura, that probably has tons of things to say, and probably also many silence to share with us by the overwhelming dimension of the questions and the experience of people here. Let's go to Peter. Pete.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. I obviously had the pleasure and honor of reading your thesis and listening to you again today. It's really enriched how I thought about a lot of things that I wrote about my thesis, and I wish I'd listened to you and read yours first before I wrote that. But one of the things that really struck me from what I read and thinking about this as well is how much of a contest of identities has really been going on in Colombia since the peace deal. And to kind of have a transformative process of what the identities that were always in play were, and it's not really just a process of negotiation, but it's very much a conflict in itself and a contest, and that's a contest that's very much happening, at various levels. At the micro level in Llano Grande, in Dabeiba, but also at a regional level, at national level as well. And it really feels down to how things are trying to be projected, and how successful those projections are, and how things are being received. But that's where the contest is taking place. And I just wondered, based on how visible, how successful these projections have been in visibilizing, the new identities that are wanting to be projected, whether this has been more successful on a more collective level, or whether it's being more successful at individual levels. And I guess, what processes do you feel? I know you've already mentioned football, so big thumbs up from me for that. But what other kind of processes do you think have been, maybe particularly successful or less successful in that kind of ongoing contest? Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. I think we have enough here, Laura. I think it's a good idea to try to come back, and I think we have 3 more hands up that I see up. So I think we will want to have that last round before the end of this incredible dialogue. I guess before handing over to you, Laura, quick reactions from my part. I mean, I think this question that Marika puts forward, I think I want to sort of rephrase it in a way to see if this also helps us think about it. And do we need an identity change or a process of identity transformation in order to rebuild trust? Or we first build trust and then we change our identity? Or how is it that thing that happens? I guess I was left with, how is this link between the identity transformation and the idea of trust? Then the other thing that listening to, I think I also said that when Rahul spoke, I was thinking about, this idea of how, the weaponization of identity, an incredible, terrible process that is very difficult to work with. How do we unweaponize identity when powerful actors use them to create divisions and rule? And how the weaponization of identity create fake identities, probably, that the moment you keep repeating them and repeating them and repeating them, because they are social constructions, they become a reality. And so how can you say that they are not identities anymore? Probably they have become after many years of repetition. So that's a tremendous, how do you unweaponize that has become normalized? Tremendous challenge just thinking here out. And with this idea of going back to a core identity when we're thinking that the whole thing is multiple and fluid. And listening to Peter and the idea of football for reconciliation. I was just thinking, I'm a football fan of the best team in Colombia, of course, the América de Cali. But I believe that many Colombians might think that, well, if I'm supporting the América de Cali and I'm bringing football, I'm reifying a very particular identity that is disconnecting me. So in a way, we try to use some ways out to create new group identities, and those new group identities could be the new source for future conflict. And conflict in itself is not bad. I guess, now the question is whether we are happy with, I think what Peter was trying to say made me think of Chantal Mouffe. Are we thinking of agonistic contestation of identity transformation? Or are we talking a more like liberal peace idea of negotiation? We all agree happily that we are going to have a bit of identity here, a bit of identity here. Now we're all happy together living in this liberal democratic world. I don't know. Those were some of my thoughts. So Laura, over to you. And then we do a final round of questions and comments, and just to see where you are with your thinking.
I mean, one thing I would say is I'm really glad Eduardo's raised his hand as well, because a lot of what you were just talking around false identities and so on, I was thinking imaginaries, etc. It's completely with him. So I'm really glad we're going to get some thoughts there in a minute. But I think we also, linking in with this idea of core identities or new identities and the context of identities and what it means, it does make me think it's a little bit like, the pursuit of happiness. It's like a bit of a false pursuit, right? For something that doesn't really exist. I mean, I think we trick ourselves into believing that identities fully exist and they are something that's stable, etc., because that's what we need. We need some sense of safety, security, and having a sense of who we are and how we're relating to others and who the other is. And, at a very fundamental survival level, like, is this person a risk to me or not? But actually, it's, as I've said, it's something that keeps evolving and changing. And even through repetitive acts, you can create changes and start to shift things. So I think it's a false pursuit. And I think the idea of a core identity is a false pursuit. And whilst I relate to a lot of what Rahul was saying in terms of Kashmir, I think we also often have a thing of a golden era when we're looking back. And I think that also this core identity is something that, I don't know, to me, it almost harks back to the idea of an essentialist identity as well. I think we need to get away from that idea. But I was going to say to Rahul as well, a lot of what he was saying I identify with, because I had the same thing around feeling Colombian at heart, but how to link in with things that were happening here, etc. So there's a lot that I relate to in terms of what he was saying. And I think there's a lot of parallels with Colombia, by the way, in terms of the inner enemy. So although it's a completely different reason, I think the idea of Colombian fighting Colombian is there are certain parallels there, and how to see the other and how to overcome that, even though they're very different contexts and for very different reasons in many ways. And thank you, Pete, as well, for bringing up some of the ideas that Alejo was first mentioning. Because when Alejandro was talking about the official versus the reality, for me, it's exactly that idea of the successive projections. There's an official discourse that's not just official at a national level as to how things are, but also official at a local level. What do people want here in the community to be projecting about themselves and their identity and the success of those new identities that are coming up, which are true to an extent, but I think there's also a lot that's under the surface that's not, right? It's never as clear and pretty a picture as often as is projected. And there is the idea of the new identities here, and I talk about it in my research as well, the new identity of the family of Llano Grande, which has been a powerful metaphor and tool that's used, a new identity of everyone coming together, the institutions, the armed forces, those formerly in the FARC guerrilla group, the existing community and so on. But actually it's something that's there, but there's so much else that's going on in the reality, and things are messier, and we know that reality is messy. So I think with everything, it's about not having these clear, beautiful ideas of anything and really just understanding the messiness of it. And the same comes up, Alejandro was talking about the Sri Lanka clear binaries and it made me think about victim perpetrator and the challenges here around, you can be a victim and a perpetrator, but it's really hard to accept that still here. And that's been a challenge in the transitional justice system here. But then I think as a final thought around the question around identity change and rebuilding trust, I don't think it's one before the other. I think it's a process that happens at the same time. I don't really know how to say it happens either, but I think if you look at the processes that have happened here, or even look at, the fact that they can, for example, have a football match and all be on the same team, right? Not that fighting, not against each other in football, but all on the same team. That's because of the process of identity change from, okay, you were formerly my enemy as a member of the Colombian army, and I was a FARC, and we were fighting each other. Oh, but we've actually got some things in common. Oh, but we've actually got different roles now, and we can see the human beings that are there, and we can see a lot of similarities and other things. So there was an identity shift that was happening there of how they were seeing the other, at the same time as rebuilding trust, understanding that, well, this is here for mutual benefit, and we're here in a process of, peace building on our side, but the state is here supposedly to protect us, although we know there are still a lot of challenges around the state protecting former combatants here. But I think the two processes are happening in parallel, and that's what we can't separate. So again, sorry, I'm going back to the messiness and complexity rather than a pretty picture, but I think we have to.
That's brilliant, Laura. I really think that you have nurtured a lot your right brain. So you just love, you have stopped this dichotomic thinking that is mainly the left brain manipulative way of trying to look at the world, and you're just trying to make sense of this mess that we actually cannot make sense of, but we pretend that we make sense of. I love that, and I probably will come back to this towards the end of this dialogue and do some final wrapping comments on that. And seeing that, I think we should go straight now to Lucia to hear the last three comments or questions that we have. So Lucia first.
I think there should be a complete separate dialogue on how the brain works in terms of life, right? Which would be super interesting as well. But in terms of identity, I think, especially before when Laura was talking about taking violence out of the identity of being Colombian, I was really thinking about sort of how the role, the different aspects of your identity play depending on the context, right? So, for example, one part of your identity maybe makes you feel connected to a group. The other part of your identity makes you feel maybe powerful and strong. And I think when it comes to violence, I think and I'm coming back to football, like in the summer, we had some heavy flooding in Slovenia. Separate of that, we have a group of rather violent football fans. They're sometimes violent, not always. So a group of football hooligans who after football games are considered violent. However, after the flooding, there were also the type of people who were called upon to help clean up, because their violence is also equated to strength, right? And I think being violent, using violence effectively portrays certain strength, certain power. So I think the question for me when we talk about taking violence out of a nation's or part of nation's identity is also, what do we exchange the violence for to keep still the feeling of power, of strength that is so crucial to people feeling like of people having self-esteem, of being a part of society that can move things. And that's just a thought I have.
Brilliant. I love the idea of bringing self-esteem into identity. I think that's a really important part that we haven't touched upon. Jimena, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the very interesting dialogue. I had accumulated questions during the whole time, so I tried to make probably the last and related to Lucia about how can we detach. I mean, I know we can because I'm a migrant here from Colombia. But is this a struggle with the national identity? But I know in migration studies, it's possible to have what Willem Flusser called the freedom of the migrant, at least to feel it at some point, which is what we detach from national identities that are very easy to be imposed on us, even if we fight it, because we have a long story and so many micro and macro wounds to heal individually, which is very connected to our history of a country. So I wonder that one is about how we detach. We need to be innerly strong to start to detach our identity from nation. Could be Colombia, or if I live here, the UK, or any other possible identities. And I wonder if in this construction of identity, transition is itself the core. So it's in movement, and that movement will change because we age, because we interact with so many others. And lastly, I wonder if Laura, you have, let's say, examples that are not necessarily football binary, like two teams, but something that is more fluid. I wonder, intergenerational, that is happening in Colombia, because with these changes that are, and this healing that is over time, I wonder how if there are successful experiences. Of course, success is not a very nice word either, but good experiences, promising experiences of this transformation of narratives across generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jimena, so much in there, and so important to have this transnational perspective. I think that really is something that we hadn't touched upon, and is such a fundamental part in divided societies, actually, all the diaspora, all the migrants, and how they identity when they do this. Actually, Frances did a fantastic dissertation, MA dissertation, on the role of the Truth Commission in the United Kingdom, and understanding how, victims who left Colombia sort of tried to come to terms with the past through the work of the Truth Commission here. So, which I think is something that is very innovative of the Colombian Truth Commission, by the way. Sorry, you see my ideas coming from everywhere. But Eduardo, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me well? Right. Well, thank you, Laura. I apologize because I got here a bit late, but I loved what you were saying, and the wink you sent my way. So of course I have to comment on this subject of identity and building trust. I mean, I think it's useful to complexify what we understand by trust and how it relates to identity. I think both identity and trust can sometimes respond more to conceptual categories, which are useful, of course, than actually sort of cleanly delineated or separate realities. I think identity is always relational. It always links us to others. I think identity is not an isolated element. There's an ecosystem of identities, some more grounding than others for us. And just like with imaginaries, that's my thing. It has to do, I mean, you have individual identity, you have communal or community identity, and that also is linked with our ideas and with our social practices. It's a network of experiences that we have. So in terms of how do we transform an identity that we're not comfortable with, or how do we engage in more trustful relationships, I think yes, we need repetitive actions, and any sort of peace building process requires time, but also I think a very powerful tool that we could have is to build spaces where new imaginaries and new forms of identities are shown as possible, are shown as desirable, and they're enabled and encouraged. I mean, it's only when people are allowed to sort of have this experience of other imaginaries and other identities come and resonate with one's needs and with one's sense of vocation. I'm using Lederach's expression there, and that's a very right-brained expression. And I think it's only then that deep grounding decisions regarding one's identity can be made, because it's not just something that you calculate left-brained, if you will. So yeah, I'm just saying I love what we're talking about, and I do think it's a very complex topic that requires a broader spectrum of how these things are linked up.
Brilliant. Thank you, Eduardo. What a journey. It's 5:30 in the UK. We have heard an incredible amount of comments, ideas, questions. Laura, of course, before we wrap up, and in particular with these last 3 comments, questions, where you are, what you want to tell us, wrapping comments. I also, we're also all probably overblown with ideas, but whatever you can share with us, or wherever you are.
No, it's great. I still think that the worst thing is when you're thinking about thinking. So I remember I did a dissertation that was all around critical thinking, and that was a nightmare, because you just get locked into circles that you never get out of. But it's almost as bad with identity, I think, sometimes as well. And actually, one thing that Jimena said made me realize as well, of course, my view around the idea of things being fluid and moving and core identities as a falsehood and so on, I think is probably because with my own identities, I don't see core things in quite the same way, right? They have transitioned and evolved and shifted, and how they relate to each other as well. The identities within myself, whereas, sorry, Spanish coming out. They all kind of, I think there's a bias. There's a bias in my own view of identity there as well, because I was thinking of Rahul's comment there when he said, what's the issue with core identities like being indigenous? Maybe though, I do think that even those things that we see as being stable aren't. I mean, I think what being indigenous is, but has also kind of shifted to an extent, right? And I think even for indigenous people, it shifts as their relationship with society more broadly has shifted as well, and they have to sort of reassert and reposition themselves in certain ways. So certain things might stay stable, but we don't know for how long either. So I think at the core of it, freaking the word core, I think that things constantly are in a position of transition and movement. In terms of Lucia's points, I love it. But really funnily as well, self-esteem brings you back to the idea of weird societies and the idea of the self. I think that's because, again, I have been in this thing of how do we see our own identities in a very individualistic way in, say, the UK and other cultures, versus where I am now, where there's far more a sense of community, and actually the self and your own self-esteem and other things actually sits a second almost to what the needs are of the community around you, and how do you think so. I don't know, it just made me think that way. It's not really a response to what you said so much as, well, it's a thought response, I guess, where it took me. But I do think it's an interesting way to think about it as well, Lucia, in terms of repurposing violence. What's the role of violence in the national identity, and what will be missing, or what would need to kind of come into play to reposition it, which I think links in then to how do we get into these changes of meanings. Eduardo's right. I think it's through spaces anyway. You've got to create different spaces, but then what is desirable? That's something that has to be set as well, right? And I think your question, Lucia, around how do you bring in other things around strength and power is really important, because we know as human beings, power is important, right? I mean, then we just have to come back to Foucault that everyone always talks about. And it's all about power relations, and yeah, I mean, it's fundamental in identities as well. So I think, yeah, I think maybe a last point, I'll bring in a couple of examples that were being asked for by Jimena, and I think also Pete had asked before whether collective or individual examples are maybe more powerful. I think a lot of it is around collective examples, and there are intergenerational ones. Actually, football is an intergenerational one as well, I will add. because everyone plays from like really little through to like, you know, what in the UK you'd say is retired and won't be playing anymore. I mean, you do have the whole range, but it's not only football. There are other spaces that are being created by young people as well. And we've seen those in Embrace Dialogue through the young people that we've had there, where we've created spaces where they've opened spaces, for example, and they produced their own report that went to the Truth Commission, where they were speaking with victims and with members of the FARC and with other groups and sectors, and bringing together different experiences and trying to understand and encounter the other and see what that meant. But we've also seen it in other ways. And at a local level, I think there are a lot of things that do revolve around the school. So events that are put on by them that come together. But I do think a lot of the community ones, it's where there's a common purpose, I think, or where there's some objective of what you're looking for to the future. There's another Alice in Wonderland quote that I love that's about, you know, it's a poor kind of memory that only looks backwards. And I do think there's an element of that. It needs to be looking to the future when we're looking for what these things are, for re-identifying and recreating new, or repurposing maybe some of the identities that already exist. So a lot of the fixing the road, you actually have had younger people there as well, not just, you know, we've had the whole range that's there, or you have them, you know, not necessarily directly doing stuff on the road, but maybe they're helping with making lunch for everyone or something. As in, it tends to be a whole community. And I think it's when everyone comes together that it's sort of the most powerful example, rather than an individual on their own. As I said, identity, going back to the very first comment, individual identities, not just about the individual, it's about the social, and it's about those relations and interactions. So yeah, there we go.
Thank you, Lau, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this space. I think thinking a bit about what Eduardo was saying, this is probably one of those spaces where we can sort of try to start thinking about it in these issues. And I hope that, you know, this journey of an hour and a half pretty much has taken you to a place that is enriching, that, you know, makes you look at things with different eyes. I would like to probably wrap up and by saying a couple of things. One, and precisely along the lines of what Eduardo was saying and Laura, is I think that when we create these spaces to talk about identity and to work on identity transformation, we need to start from the perspective to know that that the identity that we are talking about is not the real identity. That's just one dimension of identity. And just like the Tao that can be spoken is not the real Tao, we knew that from the Tao Te Ching 2,500 years ago. We know that when we speak about identity, there is something that escapes us. And that's perhaps the most important part of identity. Those things that cannot be put into words. Our behaviors, our actions, the things that we don't speak about, that we sleep with them at night, that are confusing, that are complex. And that's the second thing. And I think Eduardo and Laura were talking about it in different ways. And is that the concepts that we use are not the reality that we exist in. They are just a way of trying to make sense in our brain, in particular in our left brain, when we are talking about it and put it into words, of that reality that is incomprehensible in its totality. So we narrow it down to a very particular thing. And being able to see how we flow, how we shift, could allow us and help others see more part of that flowing of the universe, can help others move away from these fixed ideas of identity that are created by one particular part of our brain. And this is not an easy process, which is my third comment. Listening to Laura and to some of the comments of Pete made me think of how identity is an agonistic process. It's not this idea of identity as harmony is not that simple. In general, it's agonistic, it's tense. We live it in our own lives. even if we are not in the middle of conflict, so identity is something where, and makes me think a lot about reconciliation. And perhaps for those of you who are interested in reconciliation, I think the concept of Andrew Schaap is very useful on his idea of political reconciliation, and reconciliation not as being an aspiration of harmony, but actually a space of an agonistic encounter with the promise of building a society that yet not exist, but where you are in a constant process of contestation. So I think this, and a contestation that should take us where? And I think Laura said something really important, and I hope this is my last comment, and is a place where we can try to nurture healthy identities or healthy conflicts, because conflicts can be destructive, but conflicts can be constructive. So how do we create healthy identities that are based on a healthy conflict, where we move away from violence that is a destructive force to a force for constructing something that still uses something strong, but is not destructive? I think that's the big question. I feel that, we all, as usually when we talk identity, we end up talking a lot about this abstract concept. And I think we also ask about some things. I feel that at some point, probably a follow-up dialogue, Laura, and for all of us to think about, it would be amazing to go through this journey of what it meant for the FARC, this process of transformation after signing the peace agreement. I always was impressed by Rodrigo Londoño when he came to Winchester, and I asked him, Rodrigo Londoño Timochenko, the chief in command of the FARC, for those of you who do not know, and I asked him, what does make reconciliation possible? And he said, the love of the victims. And I thought, wow, what an incredible shift that it needs to happen in someone to say something like that. So, Laura, thank you very much for coming here, for inspiring us, for giving us all this food for thought. Thank you all for joining this space. Please carry on coming to the next Critical Dialogues on Reconciliation. We will continue sending invitations through the MailChimp list of Rodemos el Diálogo, Winchester, and Oxpeas. And thank you all for nurturing the thoughts of Laura and myself on this. And I think if you have the possibility of opening your microphones, I would invite you to give a round of applause in the distance to Laura Hankin for helping us.
To all of you as well, I would add, by the way, this really has been a dialogue between all of us. So thank you.
See you next time all.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, Laura.